From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Claire Harvey. It's Thursday, July 3, 2025. Fijian military personnel should be allowed to serve in the Australian Defence Forces. That's the call from Fiji's Prime Minister, Sitiveni Rabuka. He also says China mustn't be allowed to develop a military base of its own in the region. A reckoning for the childcare centre as the Victorian government reels from allegations a serial predator abused children across multiple daycare centres. Mobile phones and other devices will be banned, and there'll possibly be CCTV surveillance of kids and staff. That huge story is live now at theaustralian.com.au. Peace in the Middle East. Donald Trump seems to think he's got it sorted. Benjamin Netanyahu is heading to the White House, and the dealmaker-in-chief says they'll have a deal. Today on the front, our correspondents Yoni Bashan and Liam Mendes on the new push for a ceasefire. There's been conflict in the Middle East for a couple of thousand years now. The Romans, the Crusaders, Jews, Christians, Muslims, and now Donald Trump.
Israel has agreed to the necessary conditions to finalize the 60-day ceasefire. I hope, for the good of the Middle East, that Hamas takes this deal, because it will not get better. It will only get worse.
That was an AI voice reading the president's social media post. The dealmaker-in-chief says he's got a deal, or he's going to get a deal, or there's a deal to be done.
How firm are you going to be with Netanyahu about ending the war in Gaza?
Very firm, but he wants it to. He's coming here next week. He wants to end it too.
But is there a point where you tell Netanyahu, like, you got to end this now, you got to strike a deal?
Well, he wants to. He wants to. I think we'll have a deal next week.
That's right. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, is heading to Washington, D.C. early next week and says he'll be meeting with Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and top dogs Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth and Steve Witkoff. He's the former property developer and Trump buddy who's been leading negotiations for Mideast peace.
נשיא ארצות הברית דונלד טראמפ עם סגן הנשיא ונס, עם מזכיר המדינה והיועץ לביטחון לאומי מרקו רוביו.
It's been a hell of a month, a 12-day shooting war with Iran, American strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, civilian deaths in Gaza at food distribution sites, Donald Trump swearing.
You know what, we basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the fuck they're doing. Do you understand that?
And now, maybe, peace. On the ground in Israel, our correspondents Yoni Bashan and Liam Mendes are just getting used to life outside the bomb shelter. Liam, what's life like in Tel Aviv these days?
Well, it's been like night and day compared to when Israel was at war with Iran. About an hour after the ceasefire was announced, things just completely changed. At first, before the ceasefire, all of Tel Aviv was empty. It was amazing, almost in a way, where we could get a park very easily. We could get from one side of town to the other in a matter of 10, 20 minutes. That's how empty it was. It was like COVID again. But then, an hour into the ceasefire, everyone came out. It was impossible to get a reservation at a restaurant. It was quite remarkable to watch everyone just emerge out of the bunker and resume life and go back to normal. After being through what was a very traumatic 12 days, we saw a lot of people genuinely terrified and panicking when the air raid sirens would go off and when people would file from the beach or from the streets into an air raid shelter. And then all of that sort of disappeared. It went into the distance, and it seems like everyone's just forgotten about it.
Yoni, something that hasn't changed is the hostage situation. There are still about 50 hostages remaining in Gaza of the 200 plus who were taken by Hamas back in 2023. What's happening with those hostages, and what do you think their fate is going to be if, as Donald Trump is saying, we get some kind of deal next week?
Well, it's extremely depressing to think about. We currently have 50 hostages that are being held in Gaza, but not all of them are alive. The estimation is that roughly about 23 or thereabouts are still living, and the rest are bodies that are being held by Hamas. And that in itself is so abhorrent to think about, that this terrorist organisation is holding the bodies of people. And around Tel Aviv and around the rest of Israel, you'll walk around and you'll see the posters that are calling for the living hostages to come back, but there are also posters for those who have died. And they didn't die in captivity, although some of them did. Some of them died on October 7, and Hamas has just been holding their bodies for almost 2 years, so the families have nowhere to grieve for them. And it's truly an appalling situation that they're still there. But I guess what the hostage families here have been saying is that the ceasefire that was managed to be brokered with Iran, that presented an opportunity for further negotiations and discussions over the hostages in Gaza. In fact, what the Hostages and Families Forum, that's the organisation that advocates for the families here, what that forum was saying is that the ceasefire with Iran was a missed opportunity to broker a further deal to get the hostages out, and that the ceasefire with Iran should have been predicated on such a deal. It shouldn't have been a ceasefire that only focused on stopping the ballistic missiles coming into Israel. The hostages should have underpinned those talks the entire time. So at this stage, it wouldn't appear as though people on the ground think that there's much hope of getting the hostages out through a military campaign. That's been the government's position from the start, that military campaigns are what provide the leverage for the Israeli government to negotiate the hostages' release. But what we know is that the hostages get out through agreements in the main. Some hostages have been released through rescue operations, but the numbers are very small. And the hostage families here are saying that the only way they'll get their loved ones back is through a deal. And that's what the hope is now moving forward.
Here in Australia, we see a lot of distressing footage of humanitarian suffering in Gaza, people who are hungry and queuing up at distribution centres for aid. The Israeli Defence Forces have admitted that some of the people seeking aid were killed by Israeli troops. What's going on as far as we can tell, Yoni, and why is this so difficult?
Well, what appears to be going on is that the distribution of aid has been shambolic. It's high risk and dangerous. We know that there's no screening process for the Palestinians who are rightfully queuing up for food at those aid distribution centres. And what that means is that mixed within the crowds of ordinary people are members of Hamas. And what we also know is that the IDF has made admissions to several dozen people having been killed. They've admitted to mistakes, grievous mistakes in the process of distributing that aid. And what we've had in the last few days is the IDF updating its protocols and instituting a range of new infrastructure around the delivery of aid to include signage and directions and concrete barriers to allow for the better flow of the human traffic in the area in order to access the aid distribution. And the hope is that moving forward, this will be cleared up and the food that is available to be delivered into Gaza can actually reach the people who need it.
Coming up, more from our Middle East correspondents, Yoni Bashan and Liam Mendez. Liam, you and Yoni have been travelling around the country talking to ordinary Israelis as you complete your reporting of this story. Do you get a sense from Israelis since Donald Trump has started talking about peace that they are hopeful, more hopeful now than perhaps they were before the Iran war broke out?
There is definitely a sense of hope, but one theme that keeps coming up is that the Israelis are just locked into the fact that these wars come up every 6 to 8 years. There's an expectation that people need to be ready for either a terrorist attack or some sort of attack. Someone was saying to me a couple of days ago that they are constantly on the lookout for someone that's trying to kill them. The Israelis are living in this constant state of peril where they are just waiting for when is the next siren going to happen. For the first time in a week since the ceasefire, we had an alert go off preparing us for a potential attack. Now, a ballistic missile from Yemen, a single ballistic missile, was intercepted by the IDF yesterday. But, there is never a true sense of peace and quiet that we're so used to having back at home. People are still on edge, and it's a fact of life that Israel is going to be at war with at least one neighbour at any point in time.
Yoni Benjamin Netanyahu's on his way to Washington. We can only assume that he'll have an Oval Office meeting with the President and JD Vance and the other top brass. Some of those meetings haven't gone so well for the foreign leaders who've put themselves up. What do you think it tells us that Benjamin Netanyahu is agreeing to go to Washington at this stage? Does this mean that a deal is actually in the offing?
Well, I think first of all, I'd say that Benjamin Netanyahu is a very shrewd and very savvy politician, so I'm not expecting to see any scenes, as we might call it, in the Oval Office like we saw with Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine. I'm not too sure as yet how people should read this visit to Washington. On the one hand, we've had Donald Trump quite insistently and quite typically getting on Truth Social and calling for a ceasefire to occur as soon as possible and effectively imploring the Israeli Prime Minister to acquiesce to that. There is a school of thought that says that Netanyahu could viably agree to some sort of ceasefire deal because he's in such a strong position politically in Israel, given the successes that occurred in Iran. So he could agree to a ceasefire, even if it means causing some degradation of his coalition here. On the other hand, I think it's also worth considering that there have been many opportunities to rake over the coals of a ceasefire and they have mounted to nothing. And it's worth examining another aspect of this, which is that Benjamin Netanyahu is currently on trial here in Israel, a criminal trial, and he was due to give 2 days of evidence this week, in fact. His legal team had called for that evidence to be postponed on security grounds and diplomatic grounds of the highest order. A judge rejected that claim, asking for further evidence, and in response, Benjamin Netanyahu turned up to the court on Sunday with no less than the head of the Mossad, David Barnea, and the head of IDF intelligence. And after they gave evidence in a closed court, the judge agreed to postpone his evidence by a week, and we'll hear further evidence next week to put that off as well. So I think people should keep that in mind when Bibi goes to visit Donald Trump. There has been a war with Iran, and there is going to be a meeting of minds there in Washington. And I think top of the agenda will be discussions about regional security and the potential for further operations to take place in light of what's just occurred. So I think there's hope that there may be talk of a ceasefire, but the suggestion is that there could be broader security discussions that are going to take place too.
Liam Mendes and Yoni Bashan are in Israel for The Australian. You can check out their reporting live at theaustralian.com.au.